As I'm sure many of you know, plenty of Pokemon species have differences between the two genders. A few examples of this are the change in color patterns on the Hippopotas line, the heart-shaped tail on female Pikachu, or the difference in manes of male and female Pyroars. But there is no more extreme representation of this than in the Nidoran line. The sexual dimorphism in this line is so extreme that they have developed into two almost completely different evolutionary lines. But they are still similar enough that I've decided to put all 6 of them into one guide. Hello and welcome everyone to the Pokemon Care Guides. In this episode, we will be talking about the Nidoran lines from the Kanto region. Due to the similarity in environment, diet, and care requirements, I've decided to put both male and female lines in the same guide, to avoid 2 episodes from just sounding exactly the same. So, both Nidoran lines are quadrupedal poison-type Pokemon with 3-stage evolutions, which require moonstones to reach their final evolutions, upon which they become bipedal and gain the ground typing. The male Nidoran has almost a rodent-looking body, with 2 very large ears. It's purple in color and has a large horn in the center of its forehead, which it uses to deliver its highly potent venom. It also has 3 rows of spines along its back. It's fairly small, at 1 foot 8 inches tall, and weighing about 20 pounds. When the male evolves, it evolves into a Nidorino. In this stage, it more than doubles in size, going to 3 feet tall and 43 pounds. It keeps its large ears and purple coloring, but now just has 1 row of spines along its back, and the horn on its forehead has actually gotten larger. It now also has large sharp teeth and claws that it uses to defend itself and any females that it finds. Once your Nidorino is exposed to a moonstone, it will evolve into its 3rd stage, Nidoking. Nidoking's body shape drastically changes, becoming bipedal with thick, almost armor-like plates along its chest and stomach. It still has a lot of similar features to Nidorino, but it also now has a large, powerful tail that it uses as a weapon, and its front legs now function more like arms, with 3 large claws on each hand. These Pokemon stand at 4.5 feet tall on average, and weigh in at 135 pounds, but don't let that fool you. Between the potent venom, the spines and horns, and the power that the final evolution has, these Pokemon are designed to be dangerous. Unlike its male counterpart, the female Nidoran has a light blue color, and the horns, spines, and ears are smaller. However, they do have 2 sets of whiskers, which it uses to help its insane sense of smell. The female Nidoran is also a bit smaller than the male, coming in at 1 foot 4 inches and 15 pounds on average. When it ages, it'll evolve into a Nidorina, a 2.5 foot tall and 44 pound quadruped. Overall, the shape doesn't change too much from the Nidoran stage, but they do keep the spines on their back, which they still use to deliver their poison. Then, if they get exposed to a moonstone, they will evolve again into Nidoqueen, a large bipedal Pokemon standing at about 4 feet tall and 130 pounds, with thick plates of armor covering its front torso. The front 2 legs now change to become a pair of arms, still equipped with those large claws it had, and a powerful tail that is all muscle. It also gets its horn back, using it and its spines to deliver its potent poison, usually to protect its family. As you can see from this intro, both genders of Nidoran are so similar, yet they act and function so differently. The male line is more aggressive, actively wandering and picking fights inside their territory. But the female line is more protective and defensive, guarding their nests and young. It's interesting how the 2 have diverged so much in comparison to each other, but thankfully they haven't changed so much that their care requirements are so different. So let's run through and see if either of the Nidoran genders could be the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Enclosure. Enclosures for these Pokemon are, thankfully, the same between the 2 evolutionary lines. The enclosures themselves have 2 sections. There is the section of the enclosure where the Pokemon sleeps, eats, relaxes, and then there is the space where they need to walk around and explore. These Pokemon have a need to explore what they think is their territory. The size of the territory that they need varies between the evolutions, but they still have the same basic need. For the first evolution stages, it'll be the smallest and easiest in my opinion, as they'll need a space of about a decently sized bedroom, a space of maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. This will give them plenty of space to roam as well as space for you to get close to them and spend time with the Pokemon. A big part of raising these Pokemon is going to be bonding with them, as both genders get territorial in different ways. The males will get aggressive towards anything they don't want in their territory, and females will get territorial about their home or their den, defending it from anything they don't want inside. This means that they could end up being territorial towards people, you included, if they don't get socialized well as Nidorans. So when they're still young, you'll want to spend plenty of time with them, building up the bond between you two. But we'll get more into that in the care section. Going back to the enclosure, inside the exploration area you can put a few toys for them to play with, some wooden blocks for them to chew on, enrichment items that they can interact with and use to keep from getting bored. Now, when your Nidoran evolves into their second stage, it would be best to move them outside. This is where the bond that you built up with them will come in, as it'll prevent your Pokemon from 1. Running off, and 2. Prevent them from claiming this larger territory for themselves and becoming aggressive towards you. As for how big the entire thing should be, Nidorino and Nidorina are roughly twice the size of their first stage counterparts, and therefore the space they'll need should be doubled as well, at least needing 25 foot by 25 foot space to explore and run around. That is a pretty big space for one Pokemon, but if you don't plan on investing in a Moonstone, then that's where your worries about space can end. But if you are planning on going all the way and getting one of the final evolutions, well, let's just say you're going to want to move out to the countryside. Nidoking and Nidoqueen both need a massive amount of space, due to their vastly increased size. Each of these Pokemon will need at least an enclosure that is 50 feet by 50 feet. They take up a ton of room. Like I've always said, fully evolved Pokemon can be a lot to take care of. As for the environment that the outside enclosure should be, these Pokemon live in grassy, warm, savannah-like areas. If you live somewhere that gets terribly cold at any part of the year, then you may want to consider either keeping your Pokemon as a Nidoran and keeping them inside, or getting a similar Pokemon but one that can take the cold better. Unless you can keep the second and third evolutions inside, in which case you have my blessing and clearly an abundance of money. On the second part of the enclosure, the hutch that the Pokemon will rest in is pretty simple overall, but it will change with the different evolutions. Based on the average size and weight of the first evolutions, they should have a hutch that covers a volume of about 20 cubed feet. The dimensions that I found for a lot of enclosures online is 2 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide, and 4 feet long. This should provide plenty of space for your Nidoran to move around, eat, get some water, and sleep. The frame can easily be made out of anything, but I would suggest a wooden frame over anything else, as you'll also be installing a mesh to function as the walls of the enclosure. This way it will allow for fresh air to enter and flow through the enclosure. Plus, with the tendency for these Pokemon to ram things with their horns, glass walls will probably end up being shattered at some point. At one end of the hutch, you'll have to install an actual room for these Pokemon, a small four-sided home that could technically function as their den. It's just a place inside their hutch that they can feel secure in, and get them into the habit of staying in there, which is important for when they do move outside with their later evolutions. You should also install a water dispenser into the hutch, one of the ones that you can hang from the wall of the enclosure. I just prefer those for smaller enclosures like this whenever there's an option for them, as the Pokemon is going to be moving around really close to the water dish, and if they're situated on the ground, then that can lead to a bowl getting pretty gross pretty fast. In larger enclosures, it's not really a problem, but for the small ones like Nidoran's hutch, then it can end up saving you a lot of frustration and time. On one of the other walls, install a door that you can latch or unlatch. That way your Pokemon isn't running around unsupervised in your home. This won't really be needed for the later evolutions, but while they're staying in your home, it would be best not to give the poisonous Pokemon run of the house, especially if you have young kids or other smaller Pokemon in the house. When they evolve and do end up moving outside, then they'll need an entirely new hutch for them to stay in. Now, at this point in the Pokemon's life, you've hopefully built enough of a bond with it and socialized it enough that it won't really need the enclosed mesh section of the hutch, just the den portion, as it should have free reign over whether it wants to be inside or outside at any given time. As for the dens themselves, they'll really be more like sheds due to the size of these Pokemon. The middle evolutions will, of course, need the smaller of the outside hutches, but it still comes in at a pretty sizable place, needing to be a minimum of at least 100 square feet, giving them plenty of room to move around without bumping into things like their bed, their food bowl, or the walls. And speaking of furnishings, you'll need to get them an appropriately sized Pokemon bed, a new larger food bowl than what they're used to, and now a groundwater dish. They won't be spending a lot of time in here unless it's bad weather or they don't feel good, so keeping it clean shouldn't be that big of a frustration. When we move on to the final evolutions, things get almost ridiculously big once again. With Nidorino and Nidorina, their hutch may have been the size of a shed, but it's still a shed. And you can find sheds of that size pretty easily. But Nidoking and Nidoqueen almost need a full barn to themselves. The space that these Pokemon's hutch should cover should be about 200 square feet of ground. And don't forget that the roof will need to be at least 5 feet high to accommodate them. Combine that with a larger bed and a larger food and water dish, and it's a pretty sizable increase in space that these Pokemon need. I would say that if you know you're going to get the final evolution from the beginning, then plan for that. Save up the money and the space and skip over the middle evolution enclosures entirely, and go right for the biggest one. It'll save you time, energy, and money in the long run. When it comes to keeping other Pokemon with the Nidoran lines, they can be kind of prickly. They are herd animals, and when placed with others of their own kind, they can do fairly well. The first evolutions can get along very well with each other, and oftentimes they can be found out in the wild in groups, so they can protect themselves from larger predators. But as they get older and start evolving, they start to tolerate each other's presence less and less. The older females are better at this, as they'll commonly form small clusters or groups and get along fairly well. At least usually. There are cases of females not getting along, but for the most part that's the exception, not the rule. But the older male evolutions can get fairly territorial and aggressive with each other, especially when females are involved. There are some cases of Nidorino and even a few Nidoking that are able to get along with each other, but those are the oddities. More often than not, they'll battle each other. So that's something to keep in mind if you plan on having multiples of these Pokemon. In fact, even when moving on to other types and species of Pokemon that you could house with these Pokemon, I really wouldn't recommend anything, as anything that stays with them in the same enclosure will be at risk of drawing your Pokemon's territorial ire. There are a few exceptions to that. Nidoran, both male and female, can be housed fairly well with other Pokemon, so long as the encounters are closely watched and the other Pokemon isn't a belligerent predator, or a psychic or ground type. Those could end up causing quite a bit of damage to your Nidoran. Also, if you socialize and train them very well when they are younger, the older generations may tolerate the other Pokemon being in their territory, may being the operative word there, and any interactions between them should still be heavily supervised. I should also point out that these enclosures that I've detailed to you are only set up for one of these Pokemon. If you plan on adding more than one, you'll need to adjust the size of the enclosures to fit. Availability. I'm going to start off with the fact that these Pokemon are poison types, and so you will need to get a license from the government of whatever region that you live in to legally own one. That in and of itself can be a deterrent to people like me raising and keeping and selling these Pokemon, because getting the license isn't worth it if you're only planning on raising the Pokemon for a few seasons. Combine that with the fact that these Pokemon are hard to house, both because of space and temperament, you'll probably have a harder time finding a breeder to buy one of these Pokemon from. A lot of people out there just don't usually feel safe raising poison-type Pokemon. There are people out there that you can buy one from, don't get me wrong, but they're not common, and when you do go to buy one, they're not cheap. And if you're looking for one of the later evolutions, then that'll be even harder for you to get. On the other hand, if you live in any of the multiple regions where the Pokemon are available in the wild, then they're very, very easy to get. In the areas where these Pokemon are available, they are one of the most common Pokemon to encounter. Well, kind of. Nidoran is. You can find a Nidoran just by searching the area that they're known to live in, and it won't take you much effort at all. The middle evolutions are not hard to encounter in the wild, but they're rarer than their earlier forms, so you may need to spend a bit more time looking for one of them if you plan on catching one. I should note that it will be much more dangerous to catch one of the older evolutions as they are stronger, and you won't have had time to build up the bond that you'll need to keep the Pokemon from becoming very territorial towards you. But I'm not your parent, so do what you will. Now, catching one of the final evolutions will be nearly impossible. It is very rare that one of these Pokemon encounter Moonstones in the wild, so you'll almost never see a Nidoking or a Nidoqueen just wandering around. But it has been known to happen, and because of that, I have to say that I do not recommend going out and catching one of them whatsoever. One, they are very strong and very dangerous Pokemon that can easily cause you harm if they want to. No one but professional trainers should even attempt catching one of these Pokemon. And two, you will have zero bond with that Pokemon when you catch it, which means that it will be very territorial and belligerent towards you when you get it back home. It will take an immense amount of effort just to get the thing to not attack you on sight, let alone trust you. I'm not saying that it can't be done, but that it shouldn't be done unless you have been trained for that scenario by another professional and you have plenty of antidote and strong Pokemon backing you up. If you really want one of the final evolutions, then talk to a breeder and get a Nidoran that is close to evolving. They will have already been socialized, you can build up your bond with them pretty easy, and then you can evolve them into a Nidoking or Nidoqueen once they evolve into their second form. It's just the safest option, trust me. Care. Food, surprisingly, will be the easiest part of caring for these Pokemon. These Pokemon in the wild are mostly grazing Pokemon, eating large amounts of grass over the course of a full day. So the best food stuff to give them would be grass hay, which is simply cut and dried long grass. Loose grass hay makes up an important and large part of these Pokemon's diet, providing them with the needed nutrients to grow healthy and strong. When you get your hay, make sure that it's clean and dry, free of things like mold. Feeding stuff like that to your Pokemon can get them sick very quickly. A little bit of a warning here though, hay can make a mess when you feed it to your Pokemon, as it's very easy to accidentally get it everywhere without even realizing it. I had to use it when I had a herd of Miltank when I first started my own breeding center, and it was just more hassle than it was worth in my opinion. It's one of the reasons that I stopped breeding Miltanks. That, and I never realized quite how upsetting their udders were until I saw them in person. Anyway, loose hay should be plenty for these Pokemon, and if you stay on top of the cleaning, then everything should turn out fine. As for how much to give them, it depends on what stage they're in. As a Nidoran, you're going to want to give them about half a pound of hay a day, which should be plenty for them to continuously keep coming back to the bowl to get more. Remember that these are grazing Pokemon, so they continuously chew and eat throughout the day. They don't eat larger meals spaced throughout the day like we do. When your Nidoran evolves into their respective evolutions, the amount of food a day will jump from half a pound of food up to a full pound of food a day. Again, just put the hay into your Pokemon's food dish and leave it there for them. They'll come to eat from it when they get hungry. Now, if you decide to get one of the final evolutions, then you need to be prepared for the food intake to skyrocket. When these Pokemon aren't guarding their territory, or they're young, then they tend to be grazing in the grass around them. And because of their size, they need quite a bit more food than their younger evolutions. Going off the average weight and size of a Nidoking and Nidoqueen, you'll be giving them about 3.5 pounds of food a day. That's not terrible, because the cost of a hay bale isn't that much, but it does represent a substantial increase in food intake from the previous evolutions, and if you aren't prepared for it, then it can catch you off guard. But surprisingly, despite the territorial nature of these Pokemon and the sheer size of the final evolution, they're not that bad to feed and take care of. And now we move on to training, and it won't be as in-depth as, say, training a Pidgey, but it will be time-consuming, and take a lot of patience on your part. This is going to be a lot of reinforcing positive responses and behaviors using treats and positive interaction between you and your Pokemon. For the treat, I would suggest raspberries, as they're easy to get a hold of, and shouldn't mess with your Pokemon's system unlike some other berries. When you first get your Pokemon, you should let it explore its new home on its own for a little to get used to the new surroundings. Don't try to force interaction with it, as that can cause them to either become territorial towards you, or cause them to become even more cautious around you. If it does get territorial towards you, then remove it from the situation by using its Pokeball and place it back inside of its hutch. Then spend your time around or near the hutch, just existing in the same space. The big thing to remember here is the familiarity that you're going to try to build with this Pokemon. The familiarity will start to settle into the Pokemon the more you're around it and cause it to start trusting you more and more, building the bond between you. As well, either when it's in its hutch or it has started to come over and interact with you on its own, slowly start giving it pieces of the raspberry to reinforce the idea that you're a friend and can be trusted. Even as they start getting closer and more okay with being around you, then you start interacting with it more, petting it and using toys to play with them. Just when doing this, always be mindful of the poisonous horns and barbs that these Pokemon have. One wrong slip of the hand while you're petting it, and you'll be needing some antitoxin. Also, try not to yell or startle the Pokemon. This can undo some of the work that you've put in with building a bond, and if you startle them enough, then they could even get aggressive with you. Lastly, the raspberries make good treats, but be sure not to overfeed them. They are higher in sugar content than the hay that these Pokemon eat in the wild, and their systems aren't designed to deal with it in such large quantities. Overfeeding them can lead to a few health risks, so it's best to keep the raspberries as sweet treats for every now and then. Cost. Your biggest cost for these Pokemon are going to be the enclosures. Nidoran's hutch will be at least in the high category, possibly even the very high category, depending on how you build it or what kind you buy. And the later two evolutions, their hutches are absolutely going to be in the very high category, as they're essentially just very large sheds. Add in all the stuff that you'll need inside those hutches, like the Pokemon beds, the feeding bowls, the water dispensers, and the bill for all of these are going to start to add up quickly. And that's not even talking about the outside portion of the enclosures that these things need. Getting a hold of the kind of land that the later evolution stages will need won't be cheap. Believe me, I had to buy quite a large parcel of land myself when I moved to Sinnoh, and it cost me a pretty penny. So if you plan on getting any of these Pokemon, then you had better plan on spending some money on housing them as well. Talking about the Pokemon itself, it can go either way, with it being either really expensive or really cheap, depending on how you plan on getting it and how much you're willing to pay for it. If you want to catch one in the wild, then that's about the cheapest you can get. And like I said earlier, there are plenty of regions that these things are available in. Even if you live in a region that doesn't have a native population of these Pokemon, a couple Pokeballs, a round-trip plane ticket, and it shouldn't cost you more than a moderate amount if you do it right. But catching a wild Pokemon does mean that you're going to need to put in a lot more work in the training department to get it to trust you. And if you decide to try and catch a Nidorino or a Nidorina, then it might take you some time to find one and actually catch it. But if you decide to go with a breeder, then things will get more expensive. As I said earlier, there aren't many people who are willing to raise and breed a territorial poison-type Pokemon like this. But there are some out there, and you'll be paying in the high category for a Nidoran, and in the very high category for a middle or final stage evolution. The benefit to this is that these Pokemon you get from the breeder are going to be already socialized with people, and it'll take a significantly less time for you to form a bond with them. So it's really a matter of how much you're willing to pay to make things easier for you down the line. Food is the one spot that you won't be spending above the very low category in. Hay bales are cheap to get a hold of, and you could easily find one that weighs 40 pounds or more within that price category. Most farmers bale hay for their own Pokemon, and a lot of those farmers are willing to part with any excess that they have for a pretty modest fee. The only way that I can see this going up in price is if you order your hay to be shipped in from somewhere else, or if you order some exotic special brand of hay. Conclusion. If it weren't for the territorial nature and the poison typing of these Pokemon, I'd say that they were an example of a great family Pokemon. They're not complex to feed, bonding with them is relatively easy once you know how to do it, and unless you deliberately introduce a Moonstone to the equation, they don't get ridiculously large and resource intensive. But their typing and their temperament cause me to say that these Pokemon probably shouldn't be around children, and that they should be raised by people that have at least a little experience when it comes to raising Pokemon like this. It's really a shame. They are such easy creatures to care for once everything's in place, but getting everything in place requires an experienced hand. But if that experienced hand happens to belong to you, then these Pokemon could absolutely be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we cover the strange moon-connected Pokemon, Clefairy, and others in its evolutionary line. Have a wonderful night, everyone.